Okay, for this week, we'll be looking at the assumption of rationality. So far, we've been assuming that countries or leaders or individuals are rational. And again, our definition of rational is instrumental. If I have a goal, right, all my actions that are consistent with that goal are considered rational. Right? And so it's a pretty limited definition, but as long as I do things that fulfill some goal, then I'm considered to be carrying out rational actions. Now, it turns out that people aren't actually rational, that they do things against their self-interest all the time. And so we will explore how they do this, and then whether this makes a difference for our theories in international relations. So did we just waste 10 weeks of looking at international relations because our assumptions about rationality are wrong? And to sort of get to the end right away is it really doesn't make a big difference. We should understand when we are violating this assumption of rationality. We should understand how we are violating this assumption, but overall, it does not make a big difference in international relations, but it can have some consequences. And so that's what we'll spend this week examining this. So we'll be taking a detour and examining some decision-making processes. This comes from the psychology literature or the behavioral economics literature or the political psych literature. We've already looked at some of this in terms of looking at when US foreign policy or any country's foreign policy is not a unitary process. So you can think about the democratic peace discussions and the behavior of the opposition versus the behavior of the government party. We've looked at the role of interest groups. We looked at the role of individuals in international relations. But here is what we're examining. So we looked at institutions, domestic interest, and what we're really caring about now is this assumption of rationality, right? What is the decision-making framework for individuals? Are we rational? Are we sort of calculators walking around making cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis decisions, or are we more non-rational? And intuitively, we should think that we're perhaps not always cold-blooded calculators. So looking at this slide, people look at this and we ask them, like, which one is longer, which table is longer, and it's actually the one on the right is longer. But for looking at it, our eyes deceive us and makes us think that the one on the left, this one, is the longer one. And that is just the way that our brains are hardwired, that when we see vertical objects, we think of them as longer than horizontal objects. Another thing is sort of looking at colors, thinking about whether this color here is different than this color here. And it turns out that those colors are actually the same. But looking back on the slide, it's really hard for us to make that determination, again, just the way that our brains are hardwired to look at colors in different contexts. Okay, so what does that matter? Does that have anything to do with politics? Well, let's get closer to actually making decisions. So here's, this is from an experiment, and it's asking people whether they want a subscription to The Economist website for $59, or whether you want that to come to your house in a print subscription, or whether you want both. And it turns out when you give people those options, most people will pick both. Okay, that seems straightforward. But if you give people just two choices, you can either do the online or you can do the online and the print. Most of them will just pick the online. And that violates our assumptions about rationality. Here, we've eliminated this decision, right? We're saying that's not even a choice anymore. But all of a sudden, that changes people's preferences towards the same decision-making process, which really doesn't make any sense in a rational actor setup. But that is how the human mind works. So again, it's a common assumption we make in IR that people are rational or states are rational. However, we commonly come across decision makers that appear to be non-rational. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about comes from Kahneman and Tversky, who were psychologists who worked on heuristics. And heuristics are cognitive shortcuts that we use every day to make decisions. Now, this can come from many different reasons. It could be evolutionary, this could be just best practices, but this is a common way that people make decisions. So how do we use heuristics in day-to-day life? Well, think about if you're in the voting booth and you're deciding between two candidates you've never heard of before, right? You're sort of down ballots, you're deciding the 3rd district court's race between two individuals you know nothing about, but all you do know about is whether they are a Democrat or a Republican. And so you're going to use that information as a shortcut to make a decision about the qualities and the policy preferences of those two candidates. And people do this all the time, using party identification as heuristic, as a cognitive shortcut to make a decision on who they are going to vote for. Okay, and let's go through some of these examples from Kahneman and Tversky's work. Right, so this is a kind of famous example, and I asked you to do this. I'm going to ask you to do this for a poll, which you'll see on MS Teams. So this is how it goes. Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned about issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Is she a bank teller or a feminist bank teller? Now, this description doesn't say anything about bank tellers, and it doesn't actually say anything about feminism, but can we make some decision about what Linda is? And it turns out that most individuals will pick this one, that she is a feminist bank teller. And that is the incorrect choice. And the way we can think about it is, what is the probability that Linda is a bank teller? Sorry for this messiness, right? Versus the probability that she's a bank teller plus the probability that she is a feminist. And this quantity can never be bigger than this quantity. Right? You have to be a bank teller in both conditions, and there is some non-certainty about if she's a feminist or not, so it has to be that this quantity right here is the higher quantity. But people don't do a very good job of thinking about probabilities, and instead put more weight, put more emphasis on the cognitive heuristic, or the representative heuristic of being a feminist, and that affects their decisions related to probability. Here's another example, and this is one that Kahneman and Tversky actually applied to the Israeli Air Force. So generally is when you go on some training missions, you come back as a pilot and you get some evaluation how you did. You did well, you made some mistakes, or whatever. And so what Kahneman and Tversky did is they put the pilots into two groups, a treatment group and a control group. And so in the treatment group, no matter how you did on your training exercise, you were told you did a bad job. And in the control group is you were evaluated as you normally would be. If you did a good job, you were evaluated and told you did a good job. If you did a bad job, you were told you did a bad job. So they were sort of, I would say, fair. And it turns out that on the next mission, the treatment group performed much better than the control group because they thought they were below the mean. And so you tend to revert back up to the mean when you're told you do a bad job. And those who did in the control group, who were told they did a good job, actually performed worse on their next training mission. So what the Israeli Air Force does now is no matter how you do in your training missions, you're always told you do a bad job. We also do a bad job in terms of the availability of information. And so we do a poor job of the probabilities of big events or salient events. So if you ask the average person what is more prevalent, homicide or suicide, people pick homicide. And that's because they see that on TV, in the news, or in television shows, but actually suicides are much more prevalent. The same thing kind of goes back in terms of the risk of driving in a car versus driving or flying in an airplane. People are more scared because of the big events of plane crashes affect them more than car crashes. And then finally is this anchoring heuristic, that our minds can be affected just by some primed information. So in an experiment, in a classroom, there's again a treatment group and a control group, and people were sort of randomly assigned numbers. And in the treatment group, they were given the number 100 and not told what it meant, just a piece of paper that said 100 on it. And in the control group, they received a number of 20. And then people were asked, how many countries are in Africa? And the treatment group guessed higher than the control group. And again, they were given this number and said, this number doesn't mean anything. It's just a number to hold in your hand. But their guesses were anchored by this number. And it shouldn't have been, if you are a rational person, when you're told that information does not matter.